Welcome back to Stop Feeling Like Shit. My name's Tiffany, and this is Joe. We're going to start off with some questions today that we have received from listeners. Okay,
Okay.
first question. Why am I always tired, even when I sleep well?
Okay. So that's generalized fatigue is a really loaded symptom that can come anywhere from endocrine or cardiac issues. From our perspective, the things that we're going to be looking at the most is the gonadal function, right? So for ovaries for women, testicles for men. Adrenal function is a big one. A lot of times when we hear chronic abnormal fatigue, even with normal sleep, we're looking for HPA axis dysfunction or abnormal changes in circadian rhythm that are driven by what cortisol is doing throughout the course of the day, or any abnormalities in the thyroid profile. But with a symptom like that, it's generally a pretty thorough evaluation you're going to need to rule out all possibilities.
Why do I feel bloated all the time?
All right, so this is another loaded question. I'll give you several possibilities. Bloating can certainly be a mechanism of hormonal problems. Women tend to notice it most in estrogen dominant states. So if it's cyclic, which means it tends to happen around the changes in the timeline of your cycle, it's usually an imbalance between progesterone and estrogen, or some patients may have abnormal estrogen metabolism. One of the more common symptoms we see of bloating that is truly gut related is abnormalities in the microbiome. Certain overgrowth microbes in the gut, which generally speaking, we're talking about bacteria, fungus, things like that, will be gas producers. Some produce hydrogen sulfide gas, some produce methane. Some of them drive fermentation in the gut, which gas is a byproduct of. So it can also be a mechanism of abnormalities in the gut as well, causing bloating.
Why do I wake up anxious or wired?
So if you're waking up anxious or wired first thing in the morning, generally what that would translate to is abnormality in cortisol. So cortisol is our primary stress hormone. And while the vast majority of patients won't have adrenal disease, they will have abnormalities in the daily rhythm of cortisol. For a lot of patients that wake up anxious, what we typically see is a premature awakening response, which is cortisol is running abnormally high throughout the evening, or it starts to rise prematurely too early in the morning during sleep, and they wake up agitated or anxious. As cortisol goes up, we know that it's going to raise epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's going to raise your heart rate. It's going to raise your blood pressure. It's also going to kick the nervous system more into sympathetic mode, which is our flight or fight response. So, first thing we'd look for is there abnormalities in the HPA axis, and what's cortisol doing when you first wake up?
Why can't I lose weight no matter what I try?
Right. That is another very loaded question. So I'll give you a few possible scenarios, at least that we treat. Abnormalities in the ovarian hormone profile can certainly contribute to weight loss, or any men or women, abnormalities in the sex hormone profile in general. Thyroid is a big piece, and a lot of patients typically go and say, "Hey, my doctor checked the thyroid. They said it was fine." Most primary cares generally are going to check an incomplete thyroid profile. They're not looking at the entirety of thyroid function. Usually they're just checking like a TSH or something. Abnormalities in the adrenal profile. So HP axis dysfunction, dysregulated cortisol will absolutely make you gain weight. And then the last piece again, abnormalities in the microbiome are big contributing factors. Um, Inefficiency specifically of several very important bacteria that are responsible for short chain fatty acid production that influence GLP-1 production and GLP-1 signaling in the gut are impactful as well.
Is my cortisol ruining my health? How do I know?
So, cortisol is not an all good or an all bad hormone. It is our primary stress hormone, and it's involved in immune modulation, circadian rhythm regulation, inflammatory response, metabolic function. So, it's not necessarily that cortisol is all good or all bad. Most patients deal with abnormal amounts of cortisol at the wrong time or transient elevations in cortisol. If your cortisol is off, it will definitely contribute to health disparities, especially if it's an untreated condition long term. Patients may start to notice abnormal sleep cycles, chronic fatigue, increased propensity for anxiety, tendency for weight gain. They may notice that immune response starts to suffer. So, if cortisol is off, for sure, it can contribute to a number of health problems. Um, Absence of adrenal disease, like Addison's or Cushing's, which most people don't have. The best way to really evaluate the adrenal glands is with saliva or urinary testing that allows practitioners to gain data points of cortisol at multiple points throughout the course of the day. That way, you're able to map out the pattern of cortisol throughout the course of the day and figure out when it's abnormal, spiking, or troughing, and also look at the metabolism, clearance, and storage of cortisone to get a more thorough picture of what's happening functionally.
What are my signs that my hormones are off?
Oh boy. So that can be any number of conditions. There can be subjective conditions regarding your mood. So that can be mild depressive symptoms, feeling less invested in your day to day, changes in temperament, disposition, propensity for anger, even anxiety related symptoms. You can see disruption to sleep quality, changes in body morphology. So specifically harder to retain muscle, easier to gain fat. You may notice changes in libido as well as actual sexual function, as far as erectile function, genital sensitivity. Women may notice changes cyclically as far as bloating, water retention. They start to notice changes in temperature regulation, so hot flashes, night sweats, and things like that as well. Changes in cognitive function, memory.
Why do I feel worse before my period?
So, immediately prior to the onset of menses, well, that's two questions. If it's right and if it's a week before, for example, the start of your period, and your symptoms are bloating, water retention, irritability, mood swings, breast tenderness, generally that's going to infer an imbalance between progesterone and estrogen during luteal phase. Some patients feel really bad a day or two before they start their period. And the reason for that is what's happening as far as the cascade of hormones. Right before the onset of menses, estrogen and progesterone take a very abrupt and sharp nosedive. And that withdrawal of progesterone is really what stimulates sloughing off the endometrium. So patients may notice a day or two before the onset of their cycle that cognitive function gets worse. They may notice some hot flashes and night sweats. Their mood may change, sleep quality may go down, and that's the experience of the hormone crash right before the onset of menstruation.
How does stress actually affect my body physically?
So when we look at stress response, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about the physical effects of cortisol, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine, and then another chemical that's called glutamate. So when all of those things go up as a response to stress, we're going to see increased heart rate. We may notice that respirations become increased, but maybe more shallow. Mind may race a little bit. Blood pressure tends to go a little bit higher. Sugar tends to go a little bit higher as well. We always tell patients your body knows what stress is, but it doesn't necessarily differentiate types of stress. That's why the physical feelings of being stressed at work, being stressed at home, or stress that happens after a car wreck may all feel the same physically, because ultimately it's your body's built-in survival mechanism.
What foods are secretly making me feel worse?
So that can be individually based, person to person. A lot of things that we see in patients here are not necessarily actual food sensitivities or allergies, although they do exist. It may be abnormalities in how they process food based on what's happening within the microbiome, the bacterial flora of the GI tract. One of the common irritants that we see for a lot of patients is they struggle with what's called high FODMAP foods. That stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, which is a big fancy way of saying things that can ferment within the small intestine. So a lot of patients we see with bacterial overgrowth may get rampant fermentation, and it kind of turns the small intestine into a brewery. And that will cause bloating, gut distension, discomfort, some food reactivity, and things like that. That's what we see most commonly from a microbiome based. We see a lot of gluten reactivity in patients as well. Not overt celiac disease, but some level of gluten intolerance from an immune system standpoint.
Do I really need to cut sugar, or is that overhyped?
So, carbohydrates are not inherently bad, and I would even say that most patients can occasionally get away with sugar intake within reason. The biggest concern we have with dietary carbohydrate or sugar intake is frequency of exposure to what's called high glycemic carbs. So, the glycemic index is a rating scale for food based on the propensity to spike your blood sugar. So, the biggest concern that we have is long term development of insulin resistance, where if somebody frequently causes these big transient spikes in their glucose and therefore their insulin, we'll start to see reduced sensitivity to that hormone at the muscle and liver, which contributes to metabolic inefficiency and fat storage. That being said, carbs are absolutely essential, and under eating carbohydrates is not necessarily a long term sustainable option for a lot of patients either. So, yeah, you shouldn't eat a ton of sugar. You can probably get away with it every once in a while.
Why am I working out and not seeing results?
So, a lot of patients run into this, and that's a multifaceted answer. Part of it can be just stagnation in programming with exercise. If you're not consistently changing your training input, your body will adapt to whatever you're doing repeatedly to get more efficient at it, but it will stop progressing. Other thing that we need to look at is what's happening in the background that dictates response to exercise. So one of the things we always look a lot is what's happening metabolically, what's happening from an endocrine perspective. So if we see things like low testosterone, which is one of our most anabolic hormones, that can blunt muscle tissue growth. It also can cause disruption to insulin sensitivity and fat metabolism. Abnormalities in cortisol, which is catabolic in nature, if it's chronically high, will accelerate tissue breakdown. Even metabolic dysfunction, things like insulin resistance that influence how efficiently the body may shuttle things, specifically carbohydrates, into muscle tissue, can impact recovery and performance as well. So, really, what's happening in the background that dictates response to exercise is what we're looking